Thank you, Pastor Aaron. Good morning, Community Alliance. It's an honor to be here today with you again, and I had an opening all prepared, but I got sidetracked by that amazing video that you guys showed for the pastor there, and it dawned on me that I also have daughters that need husbands, and I didn't know that Pastor Aaron was such a matchmaker, so it will be no coincidence if you see members of my family in the near future. The message I have today is the 12 apostles and 12 lessons. And if you are concerned because you are familiar with sermons that have 3 segments and 3 sections, you might be saying to yourself, well, 12 is 4 times as many as 3, and then we might be here 4 times as long. I will assure you, I will move quickly. So no worries about that. So I'm going to focus on the 12 apostles that we just read in Luke chapter 6. I know that there are others in the Bible who are called apostles. Of course, we have the apostle Paul. We have James, the half-brother of Jesus. Matthias comes later. Barnabas and Silas are also mentioned as apostles. But I'm going to focus on the 12, the original 12 that we see in the Scripture. One of the things I'll say right up front is I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened to each of them afterwards, and just a matter of historical note, we have to make sure that we understand it's sometimes difficult for us to pin down exactly what happened to them. Most of what happened after the close of Acts to all the apostles is not, let's call it, historically solid. Sometimes we have to rely on oral traditions, and sometimes some of the apostles have very thin historical records, while others, we can be very confident of what happened to them. So as I go, we just have to acknowledge that sometimes these are just oral traditions of what happened to them, and we will just take them as they are, and we can consider them as perhaps a bit of or kernel of truth in there, but maybe some embellishments happened along the way. One of the things that I did is that I've read John MacArthur's book, 12 Ordinary Men, and then there's another book written by Sean McDowell called The Fate of the Apostles. And if you're looking to go deeper into the lives of the apostles, I would recommend, of course, those 2 books. When we look at these 12 apostles, what stands out, I think, is that they are all Galileans. They're all from the area of Galilee except for one. And we'll talk about him in just a minute. So these Galileans would probably be heavily influenced by Greek culture. They weren't from Jerusalem or Judea, which would have been more strongly Jewish, although they were all Jewish and strong Jews, that's for sure. But in the area of Galilee, they would have had more Greek influence. They certainly were untrained, but they probably were not as uneducated as we think they were. One of the things that we often think about the apostles is that they were probably illiterate, and I don't think that is actually true. Many of them were businessmen. We see, especially the Andrew, Peter, James, and John had a thriving business. They would not necessarily have been these poor, illiterate souls that we kind of think of, or the stereotypical thought of what apostles were. So they may have been a little bit more well-educated. Some of them were hard workers. They lived in a thriving community, is where most of these men came from. And we see in the New Testament, there's 4 lists of the apostles. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have one, and then in the book of Acts, we also have the list of the apostles. So they always are listed in groups of 4. The 4 groups always stay the same. The first group is Andrew, Peter, James, and John. The second group is always Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, and Thomas. And then the last group is always James, Simon the Zealot, Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot. They always appear in those 4 groups. Whether or not there's any significance to that, I don't know. But I'm going to take them in the reverse order of how they appear in each of the lists. So the first apostle we're going to talk about is Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. His name means praised, And he's probably from he's the only one who's the non-Galilean that I mentioned before. He's probably from a small village called Kiriath Hezron, which is down near Jerusalem. He was probably unknown to the other disciples. We know that some of them were related to each other, worked with each other, and knew each other before they met Jesus, but it seems that Judas Iscariot probably did not know any of them. The presence of Judas Iscariot, of course, is prophesied in the Old Testament. There was going to be a betrayer, and we didn't know who it was going to be, and it ends up being Judas, and we have to keep in mind that Judas did have a choice in this. Even though we had to have a betrayer, somebody was going to betray the Messiah. Judas still had a choice. While the other apostles grew in understanding and love and commitment to Jesus, it seems as though Judas grew in delusionment. He became bitter. He probably was thinking that this Messiah was supposed to be something that he wanted to help along. Judas ends up betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the same amount that in Exodus is listed as the price of a slave. The lesson I think we can take from Judas Iscariot is that no matter how close we think we are to Jesus, the devil always wants a piece of us. Judas spent 3 years walking with Jesus. He heard the same lessons, he saw the same miracles, he saw the same healings as all the other apostles, and he chose betrayal. The devil is still going to come after us no matter how close we are walking with Jesus. Our only way back is through Jesus. Right? Judas tries to return the money, and he goes back to the priests. And they can't accept the money, so they buy a field, and the money that they were going to pay Judas for his betrayal, they end up buying a potter's field where they can bury strangers in the land of Jerusalem. But Judas turned to them and not Jesus. Would the story have been different if he had followed the correct path? He may have been sorry, but he wasn't repentant. And then we have the other Judas, who John simply calls Judas not Iscariot to make sure we have a distinction between the two of them. He's the son of James, and depending upon your translation or your version of the Bible, he also goes by Thaddeus or Labius. And Labius means heart child. So Labius Thaddeus probably is a nickname to distinguish him from Judas Iscariot, which is probably how I would want to be known if my name was also Judas at the time. So based upon his name, and we don't know much else of him in the Bible, we might think of this Judas, as sort of a tender-hearted and kind, loving apostle, just based on his name. Maybe he was quiet and reserved. We only see him speak one time in the New Testament, and that's in John chapter 14, verses 21 and 22, and I'll read that quickly for us. John 14, where are we? There we go. And it says, "Then Judas, not Judas Iscariot, said, 'But Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?'" And I think that's what our lesson of this Judas should be. Judas wants the world to know about Jesus. He understands that it's not just necessarily for him. I think sometimes as believers, we might fall into the belief that this thing that we call Christianity is for us, and it's to benefit us. And I think that if we look at Judas's one single time where we hear from him in the Bible, we see someone who really has a heart for the lost. And I think that's a lesson that maybe all of us, myself included, could take. That we should long for the world to know and that this isn't just for us within these walls. Now, many accounts have Labius Thaddeus healing a King Akbar in Edessa, which was in southern Turkey. Other accounts have him and Peter in Syria planting churches, and still other traditions have him and Simon the Zealot traveling together as far as Iran, where they suffered their martyrdom. Now, all those are great, but the Armenian church would tell you that Thaddeus is their founder, and that he found their church around 43 AD, just about 10 years after the death of Jesus, and that he suffered martyrdom in Armenia in 66 AD. Our next is going to be Simon the Zealot, or, depending upon your translation, Simon the Canaanite. And that term Canaanite is not necessarily that he was from the group of people that we know as Canaanites in the Old Testament. It's the Greek translation means zealot. So Canaanite in Greek means zealot. So he's Simon the Zealot. And all we can really infer from that is that he was part of the Zealot party, who were the resistors of the Roman occupation. Simon the Zealot and the Zealots would fight the Romans, use guerrilla tactics, and that was their thing. The party was started by a man named Judas the Galilean in 6 AD, who led an uprising against the taxation, which was brutally put down. And the Zealot party was the continuation of that resistance to the Roman occupation. Many people believe Simon the Zealot was probably a murderer because of his affiliation with the Zealot party. Now, our lesson from Simon the Zealot could be that Jesus takes all kinds of people. He takes Simon the Zealot, who actively fought Rome and may have been a violent man, and he also takes Matthew the tax collector, someone who Simon the Zealot and Matthew, if they had met in an alley somewhere before meeting Jesus, Simon may have killed Matthew. And yet Jesus welcomes both of them into his inner circle. The Christian family is big enough to allow for differences that we have today, whether it's politics or whatever it might be, whatever differences we might have. The Christian church is big enough to allow all of us to come and focus on the one we are supposed to be. Simon reminds us that we should probably set aside whatever it is our personal goals are or our personal feelings. He may have wanted to fight Romans and kill Matthew, and we might want to type a comment on Facebook or X, and we should remember Simon the Zealot was chosen by Jesus to become an apostle. There's a lot of confusion about Simon's later travels. Different legends have him placed in Egypt, Britain, Samaria, Georgia, and Persia. And supposedly he went with Andrew and Matthias to Georgia, where he was martyred. The tradition is that he was killed with Thaddeus in Iran, so you can see how it's difficult for us to pin down where some of these apostles ended up. Now we have James the Less, as John calls him, or James the son of Alphaeus. Greek word that is used here means little. So many people speculate that James was probably a shorter guy, maybe had a small of stature, as compared to James, the James we'll get to later, who may have been a bigger guy. His mother's name was Mary. She was at the crucifixion. She helped to prepare Jesus' body for burial. James is sort of interesting because there are more famous Jameses in the Bible. We have James, the other apostle, who we'll talk to, the brother of John. We have James, the half-brother of Jesus. We have no deeds mentioned about James, no words. He's in the shadow of the other apostles. Even non-apostles are more famous than James. Mary and Joseph, Paul. Even we know the name Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. We know all of these other people. John the Baptist, they're more famous than this James we have as an apostle. And I think our lesson with James the Less might be that he is the very definition of obscurity. He serves in anonymous commitment to Jesus. The quiet faithfulness of James might be a reminder to us that we should approach our relationship with Jesus with quiet faithfulness at home, in the workplace, out on the street. And certainly we need some amazing communicators and pastors. I myself, when I learned that Voddie Baucham had passed, I was reminded that I really enjoy Voddie's sermons, so I can look them up on YouTube. Same with Billy Graham. I love a Billy Graham sermon, right? And those are big, impactful people, and we need them in our Christian community. But I think there's also some people that are maybe more impactful for us personally, like maybe the folks who are downstairs teaching the children this morning, the greeters that meet us every day with a smile when we come to church, the young families that are bringing their kids to church, just quietly trying to raise the next generation of Christians. They're just as important as some of the big, famous preachers that we have. Obscure service might be an example for all of us. Some possibilities of the later life of James include that he established the church in Spain, which there is not very good historical evidence, but people will insist that he did. Also, that he may have been stoned to death near Jerusalem by the Jews. And yet another tradition is that he was crucified in Egypt. We have Thomas, or Thomas Didymus just meaning twin. And since he is always listed next to Matthew in the list of the apostles, some people speculate that Thomas and Matthew may have been twins, but I think that's pure speculation. He's the first of our middle four group of apostles, and he's probably best known as Doubting Thomas, because he was not there when Jesus first appeared to the group, and he said, well, I need to put my hands in the holes of his hands, and etc. And so he gets this moniker of Doubting Thomas. But if we look at some other places where Thomas is mentioned in the Bible, I'm not sure that we would call him Doubting Thomas. In John 11, Jesus is headed back to Jerusalem, and they had already tried to kill him. So the apostles are trying to say, wait a minute, why are we going to go back here? And it's Thomas that says, let us go also, so that we may die with him. And then when Jesus appears a second time and shows his hands and his side, it's Thomas who says, my Lord and my God. I think our lesson that we can maybe take from Thomas is that we might need to have strength even in our doubts. Even though Thomas may have some doubts, he may have some questions, he's still ready to go with Jesus and die in Jerusalem. And I'll speak for myself here. I know that at times I have doubts. I have dry periods. I have questions. And I think if I look at Thomas, I would say, I still have to be faithful, even in those times where I might struggle. I think that's what Thomas does. He reminds us who is king, even when we may question or doubt. Later on, Thomas evangelized in India. One of the stories is that when Portuguese explorers in the 1500s ended up in southern India, they, quote unquote, discovered the southern Indian Christians who traced their religion back to St. Thomas, who evangelized in India. Unfortunately, he had a run-in with some of the kings over there, and he was run through with a sword in about 70 AD. You can still visit his tomb today near the town of Madras, India. And if you go on Expedia, I think it'll cost you about $1,700 or $1,800 to get there. And our next apostle is going to be Matthew, or Levi, the son of Alphaeus. His name means the gift of Yahweh. Interestingly enough, I found this amusing that Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, suggested that Matthew was a vegetarian. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Clement of Alexandria said, so I thought that was a little bit amusing. Of course, he's the author of the Gospel of Matthew. He's a tax collector, okay, someone that the Jews despised because of his choice of career. In fact, what the tax collectors would do is they would purchase a license from the Romans, and then they would be required to get a certain rate for their Roman overlords. But the tax collectors were allowed to charge more than was required. They didn't draw a salary. They had to charge their fellow Jews a little bit more than what the Romans required, and that's what made them so hated by their fellow Jews. They would often hire goon squads, for lack of a better term, to go out and collect from people. At the banquet that he held for Jesus in his home, of course, the only people that were there were tax collectors and other sinners. Our lesson from Matthew might be a simple one, however. When we look at his call in Matthew's gospel in chapter 9, verse 9, it says, "As Jesus went up from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him." I think our lesson is simple. When God calls, we go. You might end up surrounded by sinners or tax collectors or pagans or atheists. That's where you might end up having to go. But the lesson is when Jesus calls, we go. There's little doubt that Matthew spread the gospel. Where he did exactly might be up for debate. There's many different traditions. Some have him, almost certainly he spread the gospel in the Jewish area of Jerusalem, but then some other traditions have him in Persia, Parthia, Egypt, and Ethiopia, where he suffered martyrdom. He was either burned at the stake or killed by the spear. Our next apostle is it's going to be Bartholomew when I change the thing. I'm not exactly sure what happened here. Oh, there we go. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel. His name means God has given. He's one of the 12 who went back to fishing with Peter after Jesus was crucified. He's from the village of Cana, where the first miracle was done, which is close to Nazareth. And it's Bartholomew who says, is there anything good that comes out of Nazareth when he's introduced to Jesus? Bartholomew is one of those people who believes, I think, with his mind, right? His true character is revealed when Jesus calls Bartholomew, "Here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." So I think we see Bartholomew as someone who is pure in heart. He's a seeker of truth. He's a student of Scripture. And our lesson is that perhaps we should try to be more like Bartholomew. And that when Jesus comes to find us, he'll find someone who's ready, someone who has no deceit in their heart and who is genuinely trying to follow Jesus to the best of their ability. Early traditions have Bartholomew being sold into slavery in Egypt. Later, he's found preaching in India. Indian tradition is that he brought the Gospel of Matthew to India. He may have been in Armenia around 60 AD, where he was crucified upside down. Philip, he's from Bethsaida. His name in Greek means lover of horses. He was likely a fisherman. He's always paired with Bartholomew in all of the lists. And he's the one who brings Bartholomew, his friend, to Jesus. And later, when some Greeks are asking for advice, he's the one who brings them to Andrew, who then brings them to Jesus. Our lesson from Philip could be that at the feeding of the 5,000, it was Philip who Jesus told to go feed the people. And it's Philip who tells him that 250 denarii are not enough to pay for enough food for this big of a crowd. See, he does the calculations and comes to realize that Jesus is bigger than what we think of as the limitations on what can be done. Jesus does the impossible, and Philip learns that. Even though he can add up in his mind how much exactly this is going to cost, it's Jesus and not his materialistic possessions that are going to win the day. Traditions about Philip are hard to pin down because he's often confused with Philip the evangelist. But it seems as though he may have preached in Asia, which is modern-day Turkey, may have done some missionary work in Athens and maybe France. But there's little hard evidence of any journey that far. One account has Philip being hung upside down as he suffers martyrdom, or being stoned and then crucified. Now we're into our final four. We have Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, sometimes referred to as the first apostle because he's the one that sees Jesus and then brings his brother to him. He's from Bethsaida. He's only mentioned 9 times in the New Testament, but he's clearly a leader. His name means manly, and he certainly was. Being a fisherman back then was a tough job, very physically demanding. Of the final 4, he's the least outspoken and probably the most calm. I think our lesson from Andrew is that small-scale ministry is important. We know that Andrew brings his brother to Jesus, and then it's Peter who becomes the spokesperson of the apostles. We know that at the feeding of the 5,000, when the Gentiles come and ask about Jesus, it's Andrew that brings that small group to Jesus. And in both cases, Andrew makes the connection, and then he gets out of the way. It's the small-scale stuff that Andrew does. Missionary journeys of Andrew include Greece and southern Russia. Both of those have strong historical claims. Scotland also claims Andrew, but there's little evidence that he actually went there. He's both the patron saint of Russia and Scotland, and it's the sideways cross that he was crucified on that you see in the Scottish flag. We have James. We're going to finish with James, John, and Peter. And these 3 are sort of what's called the inner circle of Jesus' apostles, because it was James, John, and Peter who were present at the raising of Jairus' daughter, at the Garden of Gethsemane, and at the Transfiguration. So these 3 had, it seems, more intimate contact or more specific examples where they alone were with Jesus at those important times. He's also called James the Greater. He might be the bigger of the 2 James of the apostles. His father is Zebedee, his brother is John. He's always mentioned before his brother John, so some people think that means he's the older brother of John, although that's just, again, speculation. James is going to be the first apostle that suffers martyrdom. We see it in Acts 12. Now about that, Acts 12, verses 1 and 2. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So James is the first apostle to suffer martyrdom, and I think the lesson we take from there is that we need to have strength in following Christ because there's always a price to pay. James could have abandoned Jesus at the moment of his martyrdom, and he didn't. Strength in having to pay the price of following Jesus is important, and James displays that. Imagine if James, the first apostle to be confronted and to suffer martyrdom, imagine if he had just given up and denounced Jesus. How much more difficult it would have been for the entire movement to continue. So James, again, I think the three that were in the inner circle are important because James is going to be the first martyr, and we need him to be strong in his faith, just like we need to be strong in our faith to pay the price that's going to be required of us. James never had a chance to go on any missionary journeys. He's the first apostle to die between 41 and 44 AD. Now we have John, James's brother. He's a fisherman, so-called the disciple who Jesus loved, author of 5 books in the New Testament, along with Andrew, one of the first 2 followers of Christ. It's he and Peter that are sent to make preparations for the Last Supper, and it's he and Peter that race to the empty tomb. He appears to be the only one of the apostles who was not killed for their faith. And I think the lesson that we can pull from John is to journey well. When John was a young man, he and his brother, if you recall, wanted to be seated at the right and left hand of God in heaven, or Jesus in heaven. They also wanted to call down fire on the Samaritans who weren't getting the message right. Jesus calls them the sons of thunder for their exuberance and their commitment. Right? So it seems like as a young man, John is ready to fight the good fight. And then towards the end of his life, there's a story of him at the church in Ephesus. At the end of his life, he was not able to walk, so he had to be carried in by some assistants to the church. And as the young men would carry him in, he would always say, "Little children, love one another," over and over and over again. Little children, love one another. And just like John in his youth, these over-exuberant young new Christian men would say, "John, why do you say that?" And his answer was always the same. Because if only this is done, it will be enough. And so we see young John ready to burn down an entire Samaritan village because they do not follow Jesus the way he wants, to the end of his life saying, "Love one another." The lesson is to journey well. Even though he didn't suffer martyrdom, John was once placed in a vat full of boiling oil and survived. He was banished to Patmos, and he was poisoned. So he did suffer, he just did not become a martyr. And then our final apostle, of course, is going to be Simon, or Peter, or Cephas, depending upon what you want to call him. His name means the rock, and he's certainly going to need the strength. He's going to have to be the rock as one of the early leaders of the church. He's impulsive, overeager. He's the one who cuts off Malchus's ear in the garden when they come to arrest Jesus. That's Peter. He also is the one who denied Christ 3 times. And yet, Jesus still calls upon Peter to be the leader of the early church. I think our lesson that we can take from Peter is that you're never too far away from God. You're never too far away where Jesus can't come and save you. He denies Jesus 3 times, and Jesus still calls him back. Do we think he will do anything different for each of us? No matter our sin, no matter the shame that we're holding on to, no matter what we've done, we can still meet Jesus because we're never too far away from him. Peter knows that he has to go back to Jesus. And when he does, Jesus assigns him to be a leader in the early church. Peter was still in Jerusalem in 50 AD when Paul comes back, and he finds him there as a pillar of the church, along with John and James, the half-brother of Jesus. Peter's missionary work took him from Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria, Caesarea, Syria, and Rome, where he met death in 64 AD by being crucified upside down during the persecution led by Nero. The 12 apostles weren't just real people at a real time in history. They were handpicked by Jesus to expand the early church. And that's what their job was then, and today, I think their job is to provide us with some lessons. So which one is it for you? Are you like James the Less? Obscure, anonymous service? Or maybe Thomas? Strength in your moments of doubt and confusion. Maybe you're like Judas, not Iscariot, genuinely longing for the world to know. Maybe you're like Matthew. You're ready to serve and just waiting for the call. Or maybe Andrew. Small-scale ministry might be your thing. Or maybe you're like Peter. Mistake and sin-prone, but always turning back to Jesus. I pray that we're all like John, journeying well from our overexuberance and perhaps improper ways of doing our faith to ending up in the point where John tells us, little children, love one another. Whatever lesson you took from the 12 apostles, whatever lesson resonates with you, we just have to remember one thing, of course, that the ultimate lesson to all of those questions and every lesson that we might have to learn is that Jesus is the answer. We have John 3:16 for a reason. Nothing more and nothing less. As the worship team comes up for the final song, I'll pray. God, we thank you so much for this beautiful day. We thank you for the opportunity to be here and meet and honor you. We thank you for every single part of this service, for the teachers, for the greeters, for the hospitality team, to the worship team, to the pastors, to their families, to all of the families that show up. We thank you for the kids. We thank you for this building. God, we just can't thank you enough for all of the blessings in our lives. We offer all of this up to you, and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.